They say there are two types of sailors, those who have capsized and those who will. I consider myself fortunate to have gotten my capsize out of the way early on. I was doing some testing with a home-built sailing rig in my 10-foot sit-inside kayak in pretty gusty conditions. I was trying to get the thing to go to weather, and somehow the main sheet came out of its block that was located at the stern. So stupidly, I tried to turn around 180 and reach back and thread the main sheet back through the block. I didn't really get knocked down so much as I just lost my balance and the whole thing flopped over, and before I knew it, I was cold and wet and confused. I was able to bail the kayak out somewhat, but not enough to make it stable to re-enter. So I gave up and began swimming for shore, which was only a few hundred yards away. And before I could make it to shore, a guy in a bass boat came along and gave me some assistance and helped me get the kayak towed back in. The worst thing about the experience was how cold the water was. It was very early spring and I was pretty freezing, not in any danger, but just very cold. If you capsize or become swamped in deep water, your options are pretty straightforward. Attempt to right the vessel, get it bailed out. If it's turned fully turtle and can't be righted, you have the option of just staying with the boat and floating with it, awaiting rescue, and at least on my local waters, rescue is likely to come at some point. There's always people out fishing. Worst case, if you're wearing a PFD, you can simply swim ashore, which really isn't a big deal on my local waters. Land is always fairly nearby. The longest distance from shore to shore would be about 2 miles in front of Kentucky Dam. In fact, when my dad was a kid bass fishing on Kentucky Lake, he sank a small John boat there on the biggest part of Kentucky Lake in a storm. He and his friend, who were both wearing life jackets, ended up swimming probably at least a mile to get to shore in some pretty rough waves from what he described. Compared to open water sailing, shallow water sailing may seem benign in terms of danger presented to the skipper and crew if something should go wrong. Drowning is obviously the greatest threat to life faced by boaters, and running in shallow water seems to eliminate that threat for the most part, but there is a hidden danger. Most of the flats and shallow areas that I encounter on the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers, Kentucky Lake, Lake Barkley, the bottom is this sticky mud, and I'll show you what happens when you try to walk in it or even just stand in it. Got my shoe good and stuck here. I'm gonna have to come out of the left shoe. Oh man. Now my right has my right is sunk in. I'm pulling. It did come out, but it is tough if you get stuck down in the mud like that. Hard to move, and I wouldn't want to do it for any distance. I was struggling to cover 5 or 6 feet right there. It's really not any easier barefoot. You actually sink down worse because the shoe at least increases the surface area of your foot. But yeah, don't get stuck. On my local waters, I'm constantly encountering large areas of shallow flats and river bottoms, often no deeper than 3 or 4 feet, and many times only a few inches. It's true many people are aware that a capsize in shallow water can be very damaging to a boat, especially a sailing boat. It can damage the mast and sail and spars, and if the hull ends up resting on the bottom with the waves working against it for any amount of time, it can even damage the hull. But there is a much more serious concern. If you get knocked down in shallow water, there's no possibility of being able to float with your PFD or to swim. You're going to end up on your feet waiting. And if this happens in just the wrong place with that very sticky, muddy bottom, you can easily sink down into the mud and become trapped. If you get swamped in very shallow water, similarly, you may also become trapped. You can't swim away from the boat, and if conditions are just right or really just wrong, you may have waves constantly coming in and you may not be able to get the boat bailed out and refloated. Oftentimes wild animals can become mired in the mud when trying to cross it, and occasionally they do even perish. That's kind of the way I got thinking about this issue. It's really not very likely, but it's something to be aware of, that actually sticky mud is kind of dangerous. Pennants are now available at CumberlandRover.com. Historically flown for signal purposes, a pennant is that indescribable something that your boat is missing. They can help you read the wind, increase visibility of your small craft, and they just look cool, fluttering from the masthead or yard of a lug sail. You can have any color you want, as long as it's bright red. I have 2 styles of pennant now available at CumberlandRover.com.